Welcome to Living Legacies, a production of the Canadian Churches of Christ Historical Society. With me today is Edwin Broadus. Ed has distinguished himself as a speaker, an author, an educator. He's been in Canada with us for the last 40, 50 years, something like that.
Since 1975.
Since 1975, and currently it
47
is
years.
2013. So we're coming up on 50 years in which Ed has blessed the church in Canada. So without taking any of his story away from him, we will turn this over to Ed and allow him to tell us his story in his own words. Ed, thank you for being with us and sharing with us today.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Oh, it's our pleasure. Ed, were your parents members of the Church of Christ? And if so, how far back in your family history is the Restoration Movement?
Both of my parents were members of the Church of Christ. And on my father's side and on the Broadus side, go back to my great-great-grandfather.
Wow.
And perhaps his father were not. Well, that takes us, they lived in Kentucky, and a change was taking place, and they were members of a Baptist association. And as near as I can tell, my ancestors didn't change churches. They were members of a church that changed from being a Baptist church to one accepting restoration background. And so that's a preacher that they may be aware of at that time was Elder John Smith, or Raccoon John Smith, he was sometimes called. And he was famous in Kentucky and very much involved in the followers of Campbell, those associated with Campbell, and those associated with Barton Stone getting together.
Wow.
So that goes back about as far as you can go, almost.
It does indeed.
It's not, well, I should say, my grandfather married a woman that was, she was a Culver, which was a family that goes all the way back to Pilgrim days.
Okay.
And but their family line was, well, at first they were what we would call Congregationalists, now Pilgrims. But then after that, they were Presbyterians, and my grandmother Broadus was a Presbyterian, but she married my father and she changed.
Okay.
So that's that side of the family. On my mother's side, it doesn't go back as far, but certainly I know my great grandmother was connected with the Restoration Movement, and maybe some of the others. I haven't been able to figure that out. Some of them.
Okay. So you grew up in the church. What was church like 80 years ago when you were a child?
Well, in one sense, I have to answer that. It depended where we were.
Mm-hmm.
In my very earliest years of my memory, we lived in Columbia, Missouri, and that church was very small. And I think my father did quite a bit of the preaching while he was there, even though he was employed during the week. But then after that, we moved to Topeka, Kansas, and the church there was somewhat larger, and I guess that's where my memory goes back to the Columbia one too. But that was a more normal size. But then after that, we lived in Oklahoma, and for a long time I went to a church that had about 900 members. And so they had a real good Bible school program, and there were lots of people my age as I was growing up. So it's a very church experience. Then when I was a senior in high school, we moved to St. Louis, and that was a good-sized church, but not nearly as big as the one in Oklahoma. So it was a very church experience, but for me it was always a positive experience. And maybe it's because I didn't hear the same preacher all the time. My wife grew up where she was in the same church all the time she was growing up, and I think they had the same preacher all the time that she was growing up. So some of her views were somewhat different, but I had very positive memories of my church experience, and I think it was very, very good background as far as I was concerned.
Okay.
I might add something else too. I didn't know the reason why at the time, but we were readily accepted when we moved to a new place. And I came to realize after I was grown it was because my great-grandfather was a well-known preacher in the Kansas, Oklahoma, Missouri area. And for many years he was the editor of the Christian Worker, and it had widespread circulation in that area. So our family was well known, and but I realized later that that certainly affected the way that we were received.
Okay. Are there people in your childhood church experience or youth experience that were particular mentors to you who stand out in your mind?
Well, the two that really stand out in my mind are when I was fairly young. They were women who taught Sunday school. And the first was when I was real little, lived in Columbia, moved away from there when I was about 6 years old. So that would kind of limit my memory. But there was a woman there, I knew her as Sister Forbes, and she remained a family friend for later years after we moved. And she was already a grandmother, but she had her granddaughter living with her. But she taught Sunday school, and I think what really made a difference was that we knew that she loved us kids. She didn't have much to work with in Sunday school material. I don't know if she had anything. And I can't remember whether there were any visual aids or things like that, but we're talking about in the 1930s, and I think people had to work with very little, especially in a small church. And the other was a teacher in where my grandparents lived. And when I got older, like 10, 11, 12, every summer I'd go and spend 2 weeks with my grandparents. And her name was, I again called her Sister Gross. And she was the same kind of person that really loved the kids, and sometimes she had us over at their house. And so even though I was only there 2 weeks in the summer, well, I came to really appreciate her, and those two people really stand out. As I got older, well, there were different ones that I can remember. And when we lived in Oklahoma City, well, we had different preachers there, but they happened to be close friends with my parents, and they were often over at our house. The first one was C.E. McGoy, and the second one that I remember especially was Yater Tam. And he later became rather controversial in Churches of Christ, but that was before that time. And so I remember being impressed by them, and I appreciated the fact that they were in our homes at different times.
Tell us about your decision to become a Christian?
Well, I don't know when I began thinking about it, but I was baptized shortly before my 13th birthday. And I've been thinking about it quite some time prior to that. And maybe 2, 3, 4 years. I don't know how long, but whenever. Well, a good part of the young people my age at that time were probably baptized around that time, maybe 11, 12, 13. And I just remember thinking, well, this is something that I really needed to do. But my memory's not very sharp otherwise about it.
Okay.
I remember I was baptized on Wednesday night, and I think I chose that because at that time, well, the normal thing to do was to go down the aisle during the invitation song, and I didn't have much courage to do that at that time. So it seemed like better on Wednesday. There weren't as many people there. But it was something that I was really ready to do, and I never had any doubts since then. Even though my understanding was simple, I still think that I had a proper understanding.
You were pretty young during World War II, but I'm wondering whether or not you have recollections of either how the church, any church that you were part of at that time, might have dealt with issues like that, or how you personally might have been affected by what was going on around you in the world.
I was 8 years old in 1939, and I remember that's when I started reading the newspaper and reading about the war in Europe and the Nazis invading Poland. So I definitely was aware of it, but a lot of things I certainly didn't understand. Then finally in 1941, the U.S. at the end of the year entered the war after the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. And at that time, well, I would have been 10, well, almost 11. And I think I understood somewhat more. And like other kids my age back then, I might have been afraid we were going to be bombed too. And so I remember becoming more aware. And during World War II, great efforts were made to get citizens involved in all sorts of ways. And as far as young people were concerned, we were involved in paper drives to collect newspaper. We were certainly well aware of limitations on how much driving could be done because the average person only had 4 gallons of gas a week.
Wow.
And cars didn't get as good a mileage back then as they got later. So there were lots of things that made us aware of the war. And they showed propaganda films in school. And the ones of the Japanese were especially nasty. It made them look like they were all real stupid. And then, of course, as the years went by and got to the end of the war, I was 14 when the war ended, when the peace treaties were signed in Europe and then later that summer in Japan. But for a while, well, there were predictions the war with Japan was going to go on for 3 or 4 more years. Well, of course, it became obvious to me I would be draft age by that time. And so it depends what stage of the war you're talking about. And of course, I had 2 uncles. My dad had 2 brothers that were Army men. Well, one was a career Army man, so he was. I think by the time the war ended, he was a colonel, and he was injured in the Battle of the Bulge in Europe and near the end of World War II. So it just depends what time it was. I was certainly affected by the war, but I didn't understand really what the killing was like and so on and so forth.
Mm.
And so my understanding was more limited in that way. And efforts were made for citizens at home to think it was all real glorious. And of course, that wasn't the whole truth of it. But it certainly affected my youth in things that we, as we were growing up, thought about.
Yeah. Okay. Were you aware of any pacifist teaching in the church at all?
I was aware of it, but it was very much a minority view in World War II. In World War I, it might have been the prevailing view in Churches of Christ.
Okay.
And certainly there were a substantial number of conscientious objectors during World War I. During World War II, some of the church leaders came out in favor of military service. And also, you have to remember that it was an unusual war because Hitler was an unusual. He wasn't just an personally ambitious person. He was, well, probably psychologically he was sick, you know, but at least he had a terrible outlook. And I think that affected the view that a lot of people had, because later, when a different kind of war came about, the Vietnam War, there were lots more people in the church that were against that.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But I really have to say that the prevailing view that I was aware of in World War II was most people thought it was a war that had to be fought.
Okay. So, as you're approaching the end of your high school career, what were your thoughts as to what you would do after high school?
Well, I think even quite a while before I finished high school, I had decided what I wanted to do. And I suppose by the time I was 14 or 15, I decided I wanted to be a preacher.
Okay.
And then I can remember when I told my father that, and he wasn't for it, he wasn't against it. He wanted me to make up my own mind.
Good for him.
But he was, I think he was happy about the choice that I made. And so that choice was made pretty early, but you need to remember that young people made choices earlier then, I think, than most of them do now.
Mm-hmm.
I think it would have been uncommon to find somebody back then that had been through college and still didn't know what they wanted to do. And so lots of us knew what we wanted to do after we left. And I can't date that exactly, but I know we moved when I was 16, we moved to St. Louis. So I know it was before that time. So I would say maybe around age 15.
Okay. And so after high school, you went to?
Oh, I went to Abilene Christian College, as it was called then.
Okay.
Abilene Christian University today. I'm not sure why that was my choice, although when I lived in Oklahoma through my junior year in high school, there were other young people at church that were going to go there. And then my dad's youngest brother had gone there in the late 30s. And so we knew about the school then. And I would guess from my father's standpoint, he was glad I went there. I think there were reasons he liked that school better than some of the others at that time. What he thought were the prevailing views in some of the others.
Okay. And how did your experiences at Abilene and maybe people that you encountered there shape you?
Well, it was certainly a growing experience, and one that I benefited from greatly. And I liked it compared to high school because I didn't feel any restrictions about what I could be involved in on the campus. And so I did get involved in the different activities, and all 4 years I was on the debate team, and then I was real interested in journalism, edited the paper one year. And so I like the experience from that standpoint too, that I felt free to be entirely involved in whatever I wanted to. And I enjoyed the experience too at the school. And of course there were different teachers, particularly Bible teachers, that I learned to really like. And I guess my favorite one at that time was Frank Back, who would come there to teach. And when I was a Greek major, in 1 year he wanted somebody that could work for him and type up a Greek quotation. He was working on doing something in connection with translation of the New Testament and connecting things from the church fathers, as they're called, early people like Origen and others. And so he had me copying those things down. I wasn't looking for a job, but I liked that one real well and actually enjoyed getting to know him personally a lot better. So I would have to list him as my favorite teacher while I was there. I liked the one that taught most of the Greek at that time, Paul Southern, and I enjoyed having him as a teacher. And there are others that the faculty was undergoing a change at the time I was there, and my sophomore year, well, they began getting more teachers with doctorate degrees, and I appreciated that.
Mm-hmm.
So there were a lot of good teachers there at that time that came in, especially during my last 3 years.
Okay. Any fellow students that made impressions on you?
Well, every one of them. I had 3 different debate partners. First 2 years was Dean Friedley, who got a PhD in psychology and taught for a long number of years at Lipscomb. And then the next year was Bill Carmack, who's still alive, and I talk to sometimes. But he did not stay with Churches of Christ. But that was not the case when he was a student. And during a couple of years I was there, he was my best friend. And then finally, the last year it was Everett Ferguson, whom I think you know.
Mm-hmm.
And he's still alive also. And so he and I were debate partners 1 year. We got to know each other well in other ways too. So those are some of my favorite fellow students, but I could name a number of others too. One I should name, a faculty member he was scarcely older than us students, and he came during my sophomore year, and came to teach journalism. And his name was Hibbard, and he remained a lifelong friend. And later, we lived in Minnesota. He moved up there to help in the work of the church.
Wow.
And so I very much appreciated that. And he became a real good lifelong friend. He died less than a year ago. And he was way up in his 90s. So he was kind of like a student friend and kind of like a faculty friend. And there were a lot of war veterans that were there at the time, because I went down there in 1948, only 3 years after the war ended. And so there were a lot of older students. And Rory was there, and he was there the last 2 years. His last 2 years overlapped my first 2 years. And he was on the debate team. He took a special interest in me and became kind of a mentor. He's now older. And so he and I became good friends, and he helped me get my first preaching appointment. There were lots of little rural churches where you could go out, and so I went out to one a little farther down the road from the one where he was preaching. And so at first I started riding with him going down there. I was in the front seat first, but then he started going with Nell, who had graduated the year before I came there and was working in that way. He, of course, they became interested in one another. So she got the front seat and I was in the back seat of his Pontiac coupe.
Nice.
So yeah, so that was all a good experience, and riding out there with him Sunday after Sunday. And yes, he was very much influenced. He was a student, but like I said, he was about 12 years older than I was then. Well, he was always 12 years older.
Did you do a lot of preaching while you were a student?
Yeah, there were a lot of opportunities, and so all 4 years I was there. I would sometimes just go 2 times a month some places, and sometimes I'd go every Sunday. And if I just went 2 times a month, I would often fill in somewhere else. So yes, there were a lot of preaching opportunities. I don't think students have those now because so many of those small rural churches have quit meeting.
Okay. And what did you do in the summer times? Did you just go back home each summer?
Well, the first summer I went back home, and that's when I went out on Sundays and preached in a little town, St. James, Missouri was the name of the place. And I was there every Sunday. In fact, I'd go down, I guess, real early Saturday morning and do some work there. And that was a real good experience because one of the members owned a radio station. So there I was doing a radio sermon every week while I was down there. I wasn't very much prepared for it, I guess. But anyhow, I did it. And that was a good experience. And of course, it was when in my second year in Abilene that my parents were killed in an auto accident. And so my next 2 summers were different. My uncle was a preacher in Topeka, Kansas, and they supported some work in smaller places. And so happened when they supported something in a town called Emporia, Kansas, and they were without a preacher that summer, and so the church where he was asked me to go and preach there that summer. And then the next summer, another place where they had supported a preacher was without one. So they asked me to go and fill in there. And those were good experiences. It's sort of interesting. Later schools and others develop kind of apprentice programs. You could go out and work with somebody else, but back then they just sent you somewhere to work on your own, you know.
Wow.
And so it wasn't always a good thing. I believe it or not, the first summer I went out like that, well, I guess they asked me to teach on Revelation. So I taught Revelation. I don't believe what I taught now at that time. And I shouldn't have been teaching.
Wow. And they shouldn't have been asking you.
Well, yeah.
Okay. So, let's continue your life. You graduated from Abilene, and
Yeah.
then what?
Well, I should mention the death of my parents when I was at Abilene, because as I said, I preached at a little town in Missouri in the previous summer, and so I wanted to go back there. So I made arrangements before I went home for Christmas to go back there and preach the first Sunday I was home. And so I took the train home and got there on Saturday morning, and then of course I was going to spend the holidays with my parents and brothers and sisters, and so I went out to preach that Sunday. I went out on the bus, and then my parents and my siblings who were going to come out and hear me preach on Sunday night. And Sunday night came, and they weren't there. And then afterwards, there were 2 highway patrolmen in the back. They wouldn't tell me very much. They said, your parents have been involved in a serious accident. And it was, I don't know, about 25 miles away, yes, where it took place. And so one of the members there at church gave me a ride there. And it wasn't until I got there that I really learned what had happened. And 2 men, it turned out, were both coroners in that town, or had funeral homes. And they told me that my mother had been killed instantly. And my father and brothers and sisters were all in that little hospital in that town. And so and they wanted to know who should take the body, and I had to make a decision.
Mm-hmm.
Going to take my mother's body. And, so anyway, the main concern of my mind now were those that were in the hospital, and went in immediately. And my siblings, my 2 brothers and 2 sisters, were not seriously injured, but of course no cars had seat belts then, and my mother was thrown against the dash in the front seat of the car, probably killed instantly. And my father was seriously injured. We didn't think it was that serious right at the time that he died 2 days later. So, but so I called one of my closest relatives in Kansas, and my grandparents and a couple of uncles got in the car and came that night. They were there by early the next morning. So it was a night of fast growing up, you know. And so, yeah. Anyway, at that time, well, at that time, the school terms were set up. You didn't take your final exams till about 3 weeks after you went back after the first of the year. And so I did that. I went back to school, and then my aunts and uncles and grandparents took over as far as looking after the other children were concerned. So, and in retrospect, I think the others were harmed more than I was, because I was already away from home, and For a long time, I never did even think of this fact. There I was, 18. Some people, when they're 18, wish their parents would go away, you know.
Yeah.
But I found out when that really happens, you know, it's not something you want to happen. Yeah, but yeah, it was a very big thing in my life. A big thing in the life of all my siblings.
I'm sure.
So anyway, that at that time, I don't think there was any psychological help that you received from anybody. People just treated me real nice, and
That's good.
a lot of good things like that happened. I don't have any personal regrets about how anybody treated me. And in one sense, I guess I didn't work through all of that quite a bit more time because, you know, I was busy finishing school, going to the first place where I preached, and then after a while getting married, then having 2 kids. And in some senses, I guess I didn't work through everything until quite a bit later. But I would, you know, I would certainly list that as one of the things that very much affected my life.
Yeah, for sure.
Now, what was your question when I said, well, I want to
Yeah.
mention this first? What was the other?
Just how did your life unfold after graduation?
Oh, well, I should have mentioned that while I was at school, there was a lot of interest in mission work. And I mentioned this friend, Hibbard that came as a young teacher. He'd spent some time in Norway. You have to remember, all the European countries were in a big mess there after World War II. And, you know, it seemed like maybe there was an opportunity for the gospel. Anyway, because of the influence of someone, I decided I would like to eventually go to Norway, but I wanted to go and work with a church that would be willing to support me, and then I wanted to go somewhere in the U.S. and get some experience in church planning, and then go to Norway. And so that was my plan at that time. And so I began working toward that. And, there was opportunity to go back to the St. Louis area, to a suburb called Overland. And they weren't a very old church, but they were needing a preacher. And I think they had about 130 members at that time. And so I guess I contacted them first, and they invited me to come. So they hired me to come work with them. So I worked with them for 4 years, and the understanding was they supported me somewhere in new church work. And it was an unusually good opportunity because some of the other people I knew, first place they went to preach, it was a horrible experience for them, probably. And, you know, it was a big mess. But these were good people to work with. And this was a time of some turmoil in churches of Christ because of, you know, the separation or institutionalism, as they called it.
Okay.
And Canadian churches maybe were not affected until 3 or 4 years later, something like that. But they were eventually affected. And while I was a student, it was still just kind of a hot issue that people discussed. And of course, students are not blind to things like that. And so that church where I went to work, they were confronted by that. They had an interesting approach. they tried to be balanced. They get a preacher for a meeting from one side, and then they'd get another preacher for a meeting from the other side. And it was all very interesting. But and I was just trying to figure out what my own views were. And, of course, had been baptized by Hibbard, who was later one of the leaders among the non-institutional people that often came up and preached at Jordan also. And there were others that I knew personally. And so I was trying to get all that worked out in my own mind. But anyway, it was good work with that church, and it was in a growing suburb. And like I've said, that I would have had to really mess up for the church not to grow, because there were a lot of people moving in. And I think there were a couple of hundred there after 4 years. And and they supported me when I went to Minnesota to preach there. And so that was a real good experience. And it was during that time that Virginia and I married. She went to another church in St. Louis area, one that I'd gone to during my senior year in high school. And I was well aware of her at that time, and if I had chosen to date anybody, I would have asked her. I learned out from her later after we got married, and she was well aware of me, and so I think she would have accepted that here I was going to go off to Abilene, and I thought, well, I don't think I'll date anybody this year that I'm here. I had a girlfriend back in Oklahoma. She'd fallen in love with somebody else. So anyway, one day, it was an interesting way how Virginia and I got together. I thought she'd gotten married. And so I went to a funeral home one day, and lo and behold, her sister was also there. So I said, oh, how Virginia and her husband? And she said, oh, she's not married. Turned out she'd been engaged, and then they broke up. And so as soon as her sister said that, I said, well, what's her phone number? Well, I didn't get around to calling her, and her sister was more up on things than I was, I guess. And so she invited both of us over for dinner, and then we were out and went out that evening. So that's how we started going together.
Okay.
And got married at the end of my third year at Oregon. And she knew my plans to go somewhere else. And she was ready to move to a new environment, so that part all worked out all right.
Nice. So you moved to Duluth, is that correct?
Yeah, in 1956. There were, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 5 or 6 people already meeting. They met in the Y, but just a very small nucleus. I moved there, and I think going there, I thought, well, a whole lot would have happened in a short time. Not much happened in a short time. And there were some problems to work through. But I ended up staying there 14 years. And by which time we did become a self-supporting group. And soon after going there, we bought a building that was suited to our needs. An old building that gave us a home that it only cost $400. It's hard to believe.
$400.
Yeah, it's hard to believe you could buy something. But it was a good building. We fixed it up some after that. And So we met in there for a few years and then eventually bought property in another part of the city and built a building there. And, so there was gradual growth through the years. And I was also able to work with a couple of new works well, maybe about 60 or 70 miles from Duluth, quite a ways out. But the one place up on what was called the Iron Range, where they did a lot of mining of iron ore, there were a handful of people meeting there. So we went up there, worked with them quite a while, and pretty soon there was a decent sized number of people meeting there. And found a preacher that would come, and he stayed the rest of his life. I think he died just 4 or 5 years ago.
Wow.
So, and he and I became real close friends, worked together and different things. Then over to the east of us, we started to work in Ashland, Wisconsin. And after a while, got a preacher to come there. And so there were, besides what we could do in Duluth, there were other opportunities in other places. And so I considered it a very worthwhile time in my life, 14 years that I spent there. I want to mention something else that got started during those years, and that was camp work. And we were right there in the border of Wisconsin, Minnesota. I think they started a camp first in Wisconsin, and I was involved a little bit with it, but then we started one in Minnesota and was more involved with that for a long time. And that turned out to be something worthwhile for the young people in both states, because in a given congregation there weren't usually that many young people.
Mm-hmm.
But camps would have some activities during the other parts of the year too. It was a good thing. And I mentioned something else I became involved in. A real leader in camp work was Monroe Hawley, who lived in Milwaukee. Stayed there the rest of his life, just died 4 or 5 years ago. And he mainly supported himself by printing and selling Bible correspondence lessons. And he had his own printing press in the basement of his house. And he also preached for the local church there for many years. And so anyway, they were trying to think of some ways to be of service and provide something that was needed. And so they decided to work on some camp workbook series. And for all I know, they may have been used at home sometime or another. And so we had 3 series, different age groups. And I remember working on one series, and I think we prepared some for about 3 years. So that was an interesting experience during that time. So a lot of the work, some of the work was done over a broader area, camp work, other work with different churches. There was a real good cooperation both in Wisconsin and Minnesota among churches in each state. And then one other thing I'll mention, that there in Wisconsin, a group of different preachers said they ought to start kind of a fall with like a lectureship, but it would be on the campground. And I remember the first meeting that we had, somebody said, well, let's get Roy Lemons. He was at that time the editor of Firm Foundation down in Texas, a well-known preacher down there. And I said, how could we get Roy Lemons at this late date? And the other fellow said, well, we can try. And so, lo and behold, he agreed to come for the first lectures that I think those are still going on there in Wisconsin. And one time we had a visitor that you would know. Richard Cruz was up there visiting a friend, and he came one summer.
Oh, wow.
And that's when I first got to know Richard, a long time ago.
And was he already living in Toronto at that point?
No, but he was a good friend of this preacher that went to Ashland, Wisconsin, and he came up to visit him, and he came to that lecture program that we had, and that turned out to be a real rich experience for all of us, because besides the main guest speaker we'd have, different ones of us would take turns speaking on certain topics. And look back on those years, and they were real good years.
So after Duluth?
Went to Milwaukee for 5 years. And by that time, I decided I would like to go to school some more. They had a small university in Duluth. It was a branch of the University of Minnesota, in the main campus is Minneapolis, or Minneapolis, St. Paul. But they didn't have much in the way of courses that I was interested in, so there were courses like that in Milwaukee, and so I went there to preach, and also during the period of time I was there, did a master's at the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee. But the Milwaukee church was an older church, as old would go back up in there, but I think they went all the way back to World War II at least, and that was kind of the mother church in Milwaukee. And a couple of interesting things I'll mention that took place there. One was becoming racially integrated. Now, there were already 2 or 3 churches in Milwaukee that were predominantly black in membership, African American. And later, some members from one place started coming to our church, and so and pretty soon we had a really good number, and really good work with them, and so when I left, they chose to get a black preacher to come and work there. And, now, for a long time, it was a racially integrated church. I think what eventually happened was almost entirely black. And it was an interesting transition. And in Duluth, what we often had black members. There's a small air base there. Usually there were people that were connected with the Air Force, but we had one black family there in Duluth that started coming, were members of the church there. So it was racially integrated. It kind of came back about an easy way there.
Mm-hmm.
That I consider that a rich experience that we had in Milwaukee. Then Monroe Hawley and I decided we set up some classes one night a week that were being taught on a college level. And he would teach 2 courses and I would teach 2. And it lasted several weeks there during the winter months. And so that was a good experience because we drew people from all the churches of Christ in Milwaukee. And so that was, I think, one of the really good parts of that work there.
Did you meet with much resistance in the whole integration question?
No, we didn't. The only thing I remember ever coming up was we did have one. Remember, he kind of looked after the building, and we had a vacation Bible school, and we had in the neighborhood had a lot of blacks and Hispanics in it, and so we had a big mixture of backgrounds. And vacation Bible schools were a big thing back then. You could get real good enrollment, and so this man was disturbed because some of the people from the neighborhood, they weren't necessarily black, but they were, sometimes a little bit destructive. And that's the only thing I ever heard. But he was the white that stayed there the longest of any before the last white went elsewhere. The whole neighborhood changed. But I said to people, well, you didn't like the neighborhood that was here before. You didn't think you could reach them, and God's given us a new neighborhood now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so. No, that worked out pretty easily. I think racial attitudes were about as good as they could be in Wisconsin and Minnesota when I lived in those places. Yeah.
And then after Milwaukee?
Well, I had decided that maybe I would like to teach somewhere, but I didn't want to go south. But anyhow, I just thought, well, I thought some of my abilities were more suited to teaching than to preaching. And whether that was the case or not, I can't be a good judge. But anyway, one day I got a phone call from Roy Merritt. And for me, it was out of the blue. Now, he and I had good contact when I was in Duluth because he had started that work up in Thunder Bay.
Okay.
And we were his nearest neighbor. And in fact, I went up there and helped in the initial campaign that they had. Went up again another time for another campaign. And Roy and I exchanged meetings one time. So I had good contact with him when I lived there. But he called. I hadn't heard from him for a long time. He called and told me that that's when Ron was going to go further his education in Abilene. So he said that they were needing a teacher. Would I be interested? I said, yes, I would be interested. And so I made a trip over and stayed with Roy and Nell. And then Jeff took a lot of time showing me around the area, telling me about the work in Great Lakes. So that's how I ended up coming to Great Lakes. Jeff and I had known each other in Abilene. He came 2 years. Of course, in Ontario, he went to grade 13. So he came 2 years after I went there. We had a 2-year overlap. I didn't know him real well, but knew him. And he was a real good friend with somebody that was also my good friend. So he was not a stranger. I remembered him from Abilene days. And that's how I ended up coming here.
Okay. By this time, you had your family. You had 2 sons.
Yeah, they were both born in Duluth. Paul was born. We got in Duluth in August '56, and Paul was born at the end of October '56. So, yeah, it was. So he lived there the first 14 years of his life. Mark was born not quite 3 years later. So that was their childhood home.
Okay. So when you came to Canada, you were just telling me earlier that Paul was already in university.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, he finished York, and then he went to Abilene. Well, that's when he began at Abilene.
Mm-hmm.
And was there 2 years. Then went to Africa. Then got married in California, and been in California ever since.
Okay.
Mark came to Ontario, been in Ontario ever since.
What roles did you play at Great Lakes?
Well, at first I came to teach and just took some of the classes that Ron Paul would have been teaching when he was here. And so I think right at first all my work was with the Bible College. After a while, I occasionally taught a high school Bible class. I guess that depended what the need was at a given time. I think usually they were the older students.
Mm-hmm.
And grade 13 students could take Bible in the Bible College work too, or as we called it then, the School of Bible and Missions. And I found Rory a very congenial person to work with. He and I had been good friends before. When Ron came back, we found the same thing. Ron has expressed the fact that was kind of a surprise to him when 3 people try to work together. Well, maybe all 3 don't get along, but all 3 of us had real congenial relationship. And I guess during the time we were together, I think Ron became my best friend as far as church activities were concerned. And still appreciate him very, very much. So that all was a rich experience. Now the bad thing, sometimes our enrollment dipped pretty low, and we didn't have the advantage of anything online back in those days.
Mm-hmm.
Couldn't do that back in those days. And so sometimes we wish there were more students, but there were other good times, like when you came. There were more of you, not a vast number, but I have good memories when you and others were there.
As do I.
Yeah.
And then, how did it come about that you ended up in the presidency of Great Lakes?
Well, let's see. First of all, when Roy left and went to India, well, I was, and then I was put in charge of the School of Bible and Missions.
Okay.
And then had to recruit a teacher, and that's when I went to Tennessee. And Dave Knudsen was just finishing up his master's at Harding Graduate School. And anyway, we succeeded in hiring him to come and teach in the school. Later, S.F. Timmerman, who'd been in Montreal so long, and so he came and he had support to work with us, and so he taught for some time the School of Bible and Missions, and so we were helped in that way too. And, but then Jeff decided to leave after all the good years he put in, and so that's when the school was looking for a president, and some people encouraged me to apply. So I ended up doing it, and that's how it came about. There was a vacancy that they were needing to fill. Turned out those were difficult years in that grade 13 was coming to an end, and that kind of took away our opportunity at Great Lakes. If somebody wanted to stay with Bible courses and grade 13 courses, they could get the equivalent of an associate of arts or associate of science degree, and at least that would be acceptable in a Christian school in the States.
Mm-hmm.
So there were several students that did that at that time. But then during the time I was president, when grade 13 came to a complete end. And so that took away opportunity that we thought we had for a while to at least offer something like the equivalent of an associate degree,
Mm-hmm.
2-year degree. And otherwise our work as a Bible college continued, and that was where I had a lot of my interest.
Okay. Tell us about the charter for the Bible college.
Well, a door was open for Bible colleges to get a charter for a long time. Apparently that the Providence didn't want a charter anymore, but they chartered schools in the past, and then the schools couldn't make it financially, and they'd asked for the government to finance them, and they'd done all that they wanted to do, apparently. And there's some schools, my understanding is that's their early history. I think maybe that's the early history of Wilfrid Laurier. I think they were a private school at one time.
Mm-hmm. Waterloo Lutheran University.
Yeah, they didn't have to change their initial. Make 2 words out of Waterloo. But the door was open at that time, and so we applied. That was an interesting experience, and I guess I should tell it ought to be in the records. This involved going to the legislature, going for the final readings,
Mm-hmm.
So, and we'd hired a lawyer that had ushered other schools to do the same thing. And so he was there, and Doug Tolman, chairman of the board, was there, and I was there, and everything seemed to be going well. And then somebody said they wanted to speak. He was from the, I've forgotten what the provincial organization's real name was, but they handled charities and charitable organizations. And so he said he wanted to speak. And he said, these people have been in existence for I don't know how many years. And he said they never filed with us, never filed a report. And so whoever was the legislator that was in charge, he did say, well, did you have notification? The journalists put out that you notified legal proceedings. And he said, yes, our lawyer said that we had it in there the prescribed number of times. I don't know, whether it's 6 or 7 or something like that. But we met that requirement. And then he said to the fellow from the public agency. He said, "Do you people read that?" So of course he was embarrassed. He hadn't read it. Could have said something a long time before. And so they had a dismissal. Recess. And I was out there with the lawyer. And he said, "What's going on here?" I said, "Well, I didn't know anything about this." And so we didn't know what was going to happen. We got back in, and a fellow from the legislature was entirely on our side. Told these others they should have read the notices that we put in there. And so we were just required to get financial statements for, I guess, previous 7 years or something like that.
Mm.
And at that time, the treasurer was Roy Williams, and his office was right downtown. And I could walk over there from the legislature. And I walked over there and said, "Roy, we have a problem." And so he asked what. And he said, "Oh, I know that man." So he said, "We'll get this worked out." So all we had to do was take our reports back. Couldn't do it that day. He had to make it. And so it all went through to get the Bible charter. But it was kind of an interesting session to be in. We were kind of novices there in front of the legislature.
Wow. Okay, well, thanks for that. So during your time, it was a very interesting time for the Churches of Christ. You saw the birth of the fledgling Crossroads movement and watched as it became the Boston movement and eventually morph into the International Church of Christ.
Yes.
What kind of impact did that have on you?
Well, it had a rather significant impact because it seemed like just a whole generation of Great Lakes students were lost to that movement. First, we didn't know really what was going to become of it. And I can't remember the sequence of events, but they invited me to come and speak, and I accepted the invitation. And they invited Walter Hart, and he accepted the invitation. And that wasn't very popular with some people that we went over and spoke to them. But it was uncertain in the direction that they were going to go. And so and I think we had quite a bit of contact at first. And as I said, I don't remember the sequence of events. But occasionally we had one of them come and take a course with us. I remember when I taught restoration history, a woman that was with the movement and was in the Hamilton Symphony Orchestra came to a course that I was teaching. So there was some connection there at that time. But there was also some very great opposition to being friendly with them in any way. And of course, at the time you came, someone with you was Henry Creed. And Henry later joined the Boston movement, and he later wrote some very sharp criticism about them, and it affected the movement considerably.
Mm-hmm.
And there was that kind of thing taking place. And Henry eventually left that movement, but he continued preaching. And, it's been a few years, but I talked to him a few years ago. He was out in D.C. But there were a lot of things like that happening, and didn't know exactly where it was all going to go for a long time. After a while, there was a lot more clarity as to what was happening. But, so I guess you had some personal experience too, because that was happening at, I guess, a strategic time in your own life. And
Yeah.
you saw a number join the movement.
Very much.
A number of them later left in subsequent years, but I think there were a lot of changes that took place also in the movement that would make a lot of people less inclined to be involved.
Yeah. Okay. So during the time you were at Great Lakes, you were involved with the church in Beamsville?
Yes. Yeah. During much of that time, I was an elder in the church in Beamsville. And at the time I left Great Lakes in 1990, part of that time, the Beamsville Church was without a regular preacher. And so some of us that were elders did a lot of the preaching there for a while. Donald Perry did a lot. And other elders spoke on occasion. I preached different times. So that was part of what I was chiefly involved in when I left Great Lakes. And those were enjoyable years. And I can't remember again the sequence of some events, but I was there when we hired Weston Walker, and he came to preach for the church quite a bit. He later became a U.S. military chaplain because he was a U.S. citizen, although he had taught earlier at Western Christian. I can't remember how long he taught there. Then was involved when Don Smith was hired to work with the church in Beamsville. So those, in the main, they were good years, but the rather difficult thing that there must have been about a half dozen divorces among some people that were key members
Wow.
of the Beamsville Church, and all of that was within about the same general period of time. That was a tough period, but I certainly thoroughly enjoyed working with the other men that were elders in Beamsville. I thought it was a very, very good group of elders.
Okay, and so how did you come about to move to Burlington, to move to the Stony Creek congregation? Which came first?
Well, we decided to move to Burlington. At the time, we were going to be closer to Mark because we thought as we got older, we'd end up dependent on him for some things. And about that time, they moved from Oakville to Mississauga. But they were still, I guess, closer than when we lived in Beamsville. So that was part of the move. We also found that shopping was concerned, but we were coming to Burlington usually to shop and driving back and forth a lot of times.
Mm-hmm.
Also, we were babysitting with our new granddaughter, coming over. We took her once a week. And that was an experience we greatly enjoyed. So I think that was the primary reason why we moved here. We had to make up our mind whether to go to Stony Creek or Fennel or even to Oma, which was also feasible. Some people in Burlington went to Oma, although I think they lived on the other side of Burlington. So, you know, it was a choice of one of those, but there were some reasons why we decided we wanted to go to Stony Creek. Maybe part of it was that there were more people that did well at Stony Creek than Fenimore. But either one would have been a valid choice.
So Stony Creek has been known for a long time as a congregation to take a different stance on the question of role of women.
Yeah, yes. And that all came about before we moved here. So we started going here knowing that that was their practice. Now, it's still a limited use of women. I don't know if they specifically determined at the time they wouldn't have a woman preacher, but that, and they never used a woman at the Lord's table. But women lead songs, lead prayer, and so do other things publicly in the service. I don't make some personal comment like that. I've told people that it took me 40 years to make up my mind. You know, when I lived in Milwaukee, we had a man, he'd been a member of the Church of Christ and hadn't gone for a long time. And so came back and he became rather active. But his wife was Jewish and she'd come with him. And she was rather acquainted with different things. She gave me something that Stendhal at Harvard had written about that. And I think he based his arguments primarily in Christ as neither male nor female, bond or free, Jew nor Greek. And I started thinking of the ramifications of that passage. And of course, I knew what I'd always believed about slavery, what we all would believe about slavery. That as far as the gospel is concerned, the intent was to do away with it. Now, they weren't able to carry out that intent in New Testament times. And so that caused me to think from a little different standpoint about biblical examples. And really, before I came to Stony Creek, well, I had thought a lot about that. I was convinced that what they'd done at Stony Creek was the right thing to do. So that's kind of a background to it.
Okay. So, as you say, the expanded roles that Stony Creek has offered to women are still somewhat limited.
Yeah, they are.
So there are some people who feel that Stony Creek should have gone further, and then of course there's a lot of others who feel that Stony Creek went too far.
Well, in the light of what some churches are doing now, I think there would be people that would think Stony Creek should have gone further.
So,
but you have to think some of the ramifications in a given place if you do certain things. There was one person who had a very prominent role in the church. He said to me he liked what had been done, but he said, if we ever start having women preachers, he said, I'm going to leave. Well, I think they found out more people left before than they had anticipated. There was a serious loss in members. And so maybe, you could argue whether or not that person should have been listened to that much. But I think they did what they felt they could do at the present time. Maybe something more needs to be done now. And now there are other churches that are doing what Stony Creek did way back then.
Mm-hmm.
So The only good thing I can say is that at least I don't know of any churches that broke fellowship with Stony Creek over this. I'm talking about Ontario churches.
Mm-hmm.
And they haven't made it a question of fellowship.
So, with that as a background, what is your vision for how congregations should handle issues that come up, be it role of women or other issues that we know about, or maybe that we haven't even experienced yet, but will be coming down the pipes in the future?
Well, I guess my first reaction is that churches should not be so quick to divide from one another, one congregation from another. That's the sad thing in our history, that we've divided over too many things. And of course now, I guess people don't actually divide what they, the curse of the honorable village is that people don't have to go to church where they live. Of course, here I am in Burlington, and I go to Stony Creek, although it's not as far as some people in Stony Creek might have to go to Stony Creek. But the honorable village has made it so people can go long ways. And here we have people at Stony Creek that do come a long ways. Could go somewhere closer, but in doing some study about in the 19th century, streetcars didn't even run on Sunday, and so most people had to go within walking distance.
Mm-hmm.
And but that's all changed. You can go 50 miles away if you want to drive that far.
Yeah.
And so I think that's, people don't actually divide, they just say, well, I'm not comfortable at such and such a place, I'm going to go elsewhere. That used to occur at meetings all different times. People would be like that. And I guess some would come to me because they were not comfortable where they were going. And so I think that's really an unfortunate result of the mobility that we have now. I know in my own case, if I lived in Stony Creek, I could probably do more good in the community than even living this far away.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see, what was the other part of your question? How did you ask that?
I think that was it.
Okay.
How
No, I
churches.
just think it's unfortunate that it's so easy for us to go somewhere else.
Yeah. Okay. Tell us about your writing.
Well, I guess all my life I've been interested in writing. Although to write a whole book was different. But at any rate, I got interested in finding out more about early Restoration history here in Ontario, and found out some things that we were wrong about. The main thing is one that Jeff Ellis wrote about first. People thought that the group called Scotch Baptist had a tremendous influence, and that's what. Let's see, in this book on Ontario history, my mind suddenly went blank. I have his book, but anyway, he was with the disciples when it came to be the disciple.
You talking about Reuben Bouchard?
Yeah, Bouchard. And he thought there was tremendous influence of the Scotch Baptist. Well, that was not true. They were Scottish Baptists, but back then they'd use the word Scots that way. And they were really primarily from the ones that came over here were primarily from a group that had started out as Congregationalists and then adopted immersion so kind of affiliated with the Baptists, but they were pretty much linked with the Baptists in general by the time they came over here. And so anyways, I got digging around. I found a lot of things that just never had come to light. After a while, I had written more articles and things like that. I thought, well, I could put this together and have a look on the beginnings in Ontario. And Jeff and I were meeting regularly at that time. And so I did that at that time. Came out with my first book. I'd hoped he would write a second one. But he talked me into writing a second one. And about how the disciples grew in Ontario. They did have a real good period of growth in the 1800s. And then that left the period of division. Again, I tried to encourage Jeff to write about it, but he didn't want to. And so I ended up writing 3 little books that should have all been one book. But that's how I got into writing. And I enjoyed doing it. So I'm glad for what it's done. I hope to give us some more information about what took place in the early days. Reuben Bouchard made a very valuable contribution. I wouldn't want to belittle it, but I'm sure I got some things wrong too. There's no final version of history.
Yeah.
But you try to get closer to the truth.
And then you've also done a bit of writing on a more personal level, is that correct?
Well, yeah, I got interested in doing genealogy. I didn't know anything about my family's ancestry until after I was, I don't know, 60 years old or something, older maybe. And I was given a couple of things. Then I had a cousin that was on my mother's side that was interested. Just got involved in it. So after a while, I realized I knew more about the Broadus family than anybody I knew about. So I did do a book on that, and it was of interest only to Broaduses, but there are a whole lot of them now in the world, and so I was able to do that and just print up the few. Now you can just get additional copies made easily. So I did that. I think maybe about 250 or so, something like that. Helped the Broadus family. And then for my own grandchildren, I wrote a family history, this book length form. And at first, I tried to do one in general. And Virginia said, "This is boring. Can't you come up with some more interesting stories?" So I decided I'd just write something about the ones I knew something about. And I mean, one example is that you know I was in Bethany recently. Well, I had a great fourth grade grandfather that lived there, and he went to the Presbyterian church where Thomas Campbell got in trouble, and he unless he missed church that Sunday, he would have been there. And later, he became an elder in the church. And at any rate, 2 of his brothers filed some of the charges against Campbell. And so that gave me an additional reason to wanting to see that area where they lived.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, I didn't expect anybody to go to any place there. I just enjoyed seeing the area. And knew that he was present when Thomas Campbell got in trouble.
Would that have been in Washington, Pennsylvania?
Yeah, he lived in the country out from Washington, but he lived on Breast Creek, Breast Run.
Neat. Wow.
Yeah. So anyway, after a while I realized some interesting things do come up. And so I got involved in that. It was I finally finished that. Had to go to some DNA testing to figure out where my mother came from.
What did that show?
For a long time, we thought she was of Dutch origin because some of the Dutch people, they had the name, some Dorland, and my mother's maiden name was Derling. But there were also Irish people that had that. I was kind of disappointed when I found that out because these Dutch people were on Long Island before the Revolution. So, but she wasn't of that lineage.
Okay.
I already had Irish ancestors.
Okay. Your story wouldn't be complete if you didn't tell us more about Virginia.
Oh, okay. Well, as I said, I was attracted to her rather early while we were both in high school, but I didn't do anything about it. But the Lord took care of that. Her early engagement in her life didn't end up in marriage, and so I met her at the time, or met her again at the time that she was. I'd say she was interested in marrying again. This goes back to the age. By the time she turned 23, she thought, well, she was 23 when we got married. By the time she turned 22, she said she might be unmarried all of her life. So she was beginning to make plans for that. So anyhow, it was quite a change for her. To suddenly become the wife of somebody that was a preacher. And I'd already been with that church for 3 years. And so when I think back, that was really something for her, But she adapted very, very well. And during all the years that we were in Duluth, she really was very heavily involved in whether me having people over or other things going on at church. And just to give one example, I remember Mark was born in early July. At the end of August, we had a vacation Bible school. She was teaching in the vacation Bible school with Mark in a crib in the room.
Wow.
So now, when we lived in Milwaukee, she had a illness that was unexplained for quite a while. But finally, it was really not till after we got to Canada, she learned that all they were panic attacks. But I mean, I won't go into the detail that led up to it. It wasn't her fault, but anyway, she got blamed for some things she shouldn't have. And so they were panic attacks that would leave her incapable of speaking for 15 or 20 minutes. And so there were some possible causes that were much more serious. And so while we lived in Milwaukee, well, she still suffered periodically from those. And, it wasn't until we found the right doctor here in Canada that he knew right away what was probably the problem and sent her to a specialist. And so that enabled her to kind of return to normality, and what she could do. So she was a rich blessing in my life, and wonderful mother to both of the boys. And thinks she grew old before I did. By the time she was 80, I think, she was, well, she had cancer then, of course. But by the time we moved to Stony Creek, well, she wasn't able to do some of the things that she had done before, and been very much involved in. But and I think I was richly blessed to have her as my wife.
Do you have a favorite scripture?
No. I think it has changed through the years. I guess way back when I was young, read a book by Elton Trueblood, the Quaker, and he talked about different aspects of Christian life. Some people emphasize service, some emphasize devotion, piety, things of that sort, and some emphasize intellectual art, and maybe they become college teachers or something like that, And but I surmised that my interest at first was more in service, I think. But as I grew older, emphasis was more in relationship with God. And not that that was not important, or not that service no longer was important, but your emphasis changes over the period. But in more recent years, I think one passage I've come to really appreciate is in 2 Corinthians 3, where Paul, first of all, uses the illustration of Moses, how when he was in the presence of God, face shone with Sean, to use a Canadian pronunciation. I tried to adapt, usually, by the way. So, anyhow, it says in that passage, well, the Lord, that's the Spirit. And he said, now, with the Spirit, we're transformed from one degree of glory to another. It's not from ourselves, but it's from the Lord, who is the Spirit, he said. And that's a passage that I come to love. But hope as the years have gone by that I've changed for the better. But that's what I think of. It means a lot. But there are others I can mention too.
Any particular hymns that are near and dear to you?
Well, this came up with my sons. They wanted to know at my funeral if there were any songs I would want to sing. And at first I said no. One day I was with Mark. We were over in Grand Rapids. And we'd gone to something at the Calvinist school there. So anyway, we'd gone to a store after leaving there. And I was sitting in the car and they played the song. and song. I've sung all my life, but I never thought of it this way. But that was, now I got to think of the title of the song. You'd think I could remember it. It's on Christ, the solid rock I stand, all over the ground is sinking sand.
My hope is built on nothing
Yeah,
less.
my hope is built on nothing less. And I thought, well, that's really how I've tried to live my life. And so when Mark came back, I said, well, I just heard a song that I think it would be a good one to sing at my funeral. And that one is one, yeah. And, that's the only other one I ever said to them. Hope it's sung at my funeral. I noted it was sung at Keith's funeral. I don't know if it was one that he picked out or not. I didn't ever ascertain that. By and large, if there's a funeral service, I'd rather my sons would pick up something that's meaningful to them. It doesn't have to be something meaningful to me. What? I don't know what I'd be thinking at the time.
Yeah, you'll be past all that.
Yeah.
And what advice would you offer to young preachers today, or to Christians of today, or to churches of today?
About what?
Take your pick. You give the advice.
Oh, okay. Well, sometimes I felt at loss. If I was beginning preaching now, I don't know for sure what I would do, or how I would approach it. But I think we do need to recognize that what most people are thinking is different than what they thought when I first started out. I think at that time a lot of people were perhaps more interested in what's right. I think now people are more interested in what appeals to them. And I hear people say sometimes, oh, I wasn't comfortable in such and such a place. I don't know if I don't think it's primarily a question of where we're comfortable, but I just think the basic questions that people are asking are different. People need to come to learn more about what people are asking. If they're asking the wrong thing, so try to find a way to lead them to ask the right things.
And thank you. We really appreciate you taking the time out to talk with us.
Well, I appreciate being asked to do it. It was good to review some things in my life, and maybe some things I hadn't thought about very much for a long time.
Given that you were baptized roughly 80 years ago, you have shown a great example that is a challenge for all of us to follow, of 8 decades of faithfulness, of service, of devotion, and you've been a blessing in the Lord's kingdom, a blessing in the lives of so many of us.
Well, thank you. And thank you for taking time to interview me.
Oh, it's been our pleasure. Thank you for watching this installment of Living Legacies. I'm Murray Hibbard with the Canadian Churches of Christ Historical Society. And we again thank Edwin Broadus for his participation in this endeavor and his time with us today.